Okay, guys, I'm going to show you how to craft a unique piece of gear with a named modifier that doesn't exist on trade. So, for example, an evasion shield with a fractured temple mod doesn't exist on trade. It's the only one of its kind. I'm going to show you how I made it. Therefore, probably making this process a lot cheaper for people, and also it's going to give you some ideas of how to create cool items that are specific to your build, because probably nobody wants this, but if you did want this cold damage roll with spell suppression, for example, you can now move this mod onto a base that lets you get spell suppression. It's all deterministic, so there's at no point after the start can you fail this. With some pieces of gear, the entire process is deterministic, which I'll explain. First, I'm going to run through how I created the shield, and then I'll get into the nitty-gritty at the end with the other bases, because I've tried to record this a few times, and when I start talking about other examples, it gets a bit confusing, and I want this to be understandable for everybody. So, once you've got your item that has a named modifier, so for example, this says toe pertains, I'm holding the Alt key for this. You need to somehow obviously get this, so for example, off this energy shield base onto this base that you want. Now, with bases that are of the same type, so say energy shield, or evasion, this process can be made deterministically, which I'll discuss at the end sort of the video, but unfortunately, for the ignoring the nitty-gritty, it wasn't possible with this. So what did we do? We took our mod and we took our shield and we put on the PoE1 Recombinator, and we just kept smashing them together until eventually the Topetains mod appeared on the buckler. Now, at this point, you might end up with a shield, yeah, that looks something a bit like this, and maybe it's got some random modifiers on it, maybe it's got some junk on it, and you're not happy with the craft, and you're thinking to yourself, like, look at this item, what can I do with it? Yes, I have the cold damage roll on the shield, but there's nothing I can really do here to craft it. So to make this process easier, I wanted it fractured, because then if this was fractured, obviously I can then go into the essences and, well, you can spam any essence you want. If for some reason I wanted something weird with fire damage if you've blocked, all of a sudden you're creating this item that just doesn't exist, and you know, you're creating something cool, right? So having it fractured for me was like really important. Now, how do we fracture it without messing up? Well, this is where like the recombination tech comes in. So the idea here, and I'll explain again how to do it deterministically, is you want the modifier you want to keep, be it a named suffix or a named prefix, to be the only thing of that prefix or suffix. So here, I only want the prefix to be the incursion mod. How do we do that without bricking the item? Now, if it was a body armor or a helmet, you could Eldritch annul and obviously annul off the correct amount of modifiers and make it pretty much deterministic. But the cool tech here is really, for me, is like removing the fracture and keeping the base, because sometimes the bases are expensive, and to note the roll matters, because the roll when it transfers stays the same, so it's okay to actually buy a good roll. Now, we get to this point, what can we do? Well, for this specific one, what I realized at the time, I thought it was going to have to just be RNG annulling it. You can see there I annulled, the mod went. Damn, I didn't want that to happen. That did happen the first time. We're new to this kind of tech, and I made some mistakes. What I realized is I can actually, for this specific one, because it's a caster modifier, I can put on cannot roll caster modifiers, and that means I will never hit the caster mod. Now you can see there I annulled the caster actual mod, and I'll just have to recraft it. I annulled it again. That's minus a divine. And there we go. And then what you can do is then, unfortunately, you know, I think you do need a suffix. You then exalt I got a prefix, we're crying, I got a suffix, cannot roll caster mods, annul, 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 craft it on again, annul, exalt. Okay, we're good. This is RNG, but it's deterministic, and it does cost some money, but there are ways obviously to make this cheaper. If this was a armor base, you could Eldritch annul, and when you get to that last process where you've only got your prefix, if it was an armor base, boots, chest, helmet, you can obviously influence it and then guarantee to exalt on a suffix with the Eldritch currency. With this particular item, it was a bit awkward, and it did cost a bit of money to get to that point where we just had the prefix and the suffix, but it was deterministic. You know, there was never a part of the craft where I was going to fail. So you end up with an item that looks like this, right? Now, what I wanted, and this is what I did to begin with, was I then thought, brilliant, I'm now going to mush the item across. And then I said to myself, you idiot, you've just spent all those divines. You can't actually fracture it because it needs 4 modifiers. Ah, yes. So that was about 10 divines I wasted. Don't do that. What you want to do is obviously that's cool. You can move them back and forth, and that's how you would move the modifier. You know, once you got to that part where you just had the prefix and the suffix, and I'll explain how you move it, that's what you do. But I was like, you idiot, you need to fracture it first. That's the whole point. So I wanted it on this base, and I wanted it fractured. So I know, stupid, isn't it? We got to this part, so I had to do some exalts, blah blah blah. Point is, we've got the main thing to take away from all of this junk is when you're fracturing it, make sure you only have the one suffix or the one prefix, right? That's the thing that matters, because then when the fracture fails, you want to be able to move your item across, and you don't want it to have multiple prefixes or multiple suffixes depending on which one you're trying to keep, right? So let's just imagine we've done it correctly, and here we go. We're at the point where we've moved it across, and you've got this named modifier, and you've got your 3 suffixes, and you go for the fracture, and you hit the fracturing orb, and here, lucky, you hit it, job done. Now you go craft your item. If you don't hit it, what normally would happen now is you think to yourself, I'm screwed because I don't want that modifier on my shield. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to have to find a new base. You don't have to find a new base now. You can move it. How you do this is really cool. So once you have this set up, right, you then just go ahead and you find once you've found the setup, you go ahead and you find a shield, right? You go and buy another base, and you buy your base, and there's only one thing to note here, is it needs to have one prefix, and the rest doesn't really matter. The prefix it needs to have, and I'm saying prefix because I'm trying to move a prefix across. If you were moving a suffix, you'd do it for a suffix, but in this example, it's a prefix. So what you would do is you're trying to find something that doesn't naturally roll on that base. Now that we have this one, you know, and we have this one, they're both now evasion bases, right? This is kind of a bad example because this one also rolls energy shield, but let's just pretend, for example, this is 2 evasion shields. Okay, what do we do now? Now you go to PoE mods and you have a look at evasion shields, right? Dexterity shields, and you have a look at them. Okay, I've got 2 dexterity bases now. What doesn't roll on them, and what is a prefix? Okay, intelligence can't roll. Energy shield can't roll on it. Things like that, right? You're looking for a prefix here. You're looking for a prefix that does not roll naturally. one of the examples is this, is energy shield. How do you do that? You go and you get an energy shield essence and you put it on the item. The key takeaway from all of this, and I know this seems like a confusing process, but it is not once you've got to grips with it, is the key things to note are the prefix has to be a non-named modifier, so not topetanes, right? A non-named modifier that doesn't roll on the item. That's all you have to know. So when you use an essence of woe, because that's a really high level one, and you press Alt, you will notice that the prefix here says essence. We don't want that, right? We don't want that because that won't work. When you try to mush the items together, they will have a named modifier of the essence and a named modifier of topetane, and when you try to recombinate them, it will poof and nothing will happen. If there's only one named modifier, it will shift it across because the energy shield doesn't naturally roll. So if you use a low level one, you will notice that it says shining. It doesn't say that it's an essence modifier. Now you'll do the same process. You will annul it down until it's only got one prefix, like so. And annuls are really cheap, so it's basically free. So now this item is great. This only has the prefix that can't naturally roll, so it won't move it across, and a named modifier, right? So for example, what would happen is if you were to go and get this, right, you take your failed fracture, because it has one prefix that's named, and then you recombinate it with this item. So you take this, the only prefix is a non-named modifier that doesn't naturally roll like a low-level energy shield. It's not called an essence. It's not anything fancy. It has no name. And you were to go and put this failed fracture into the recombinator with it and press the question mark and then recombinate it. So, you know, use the unstable one, right? The one with the lit up question mark. And you're to recombinate these two. What will happen is the modifier will always stay. And that's what's cool about it, because if you mush them across, fractured mods can't transfer. So you just end up with an item that arrives that just simply has one prefix with, you know, some random suffixes. And then you repeat the process again. You know, you don't scour it, you know, you get yourself to have 4 modifiers and then you fracture it again. If it fails, you go and you make another one of these shields, one prefix of the shining, because energy shield can't roll on an evasion base. Please ignore the fact this has energy shield because, you know, anyway. So yeah, it can't roll on that. So you then slam it in there, put it in there. Oh no, you know, I failed the fracture, recombinate it. You go again, you get the fracturing orb. Oh, you fail. Make another base, move it across. Failed the fracture, move it across. Fail the fracture, move it across. Fail the fracture, move it across. Bang, we finally hit it. Okay. Now that might seem expensive. That might seem, you might get the fracture the first time, the second time, whatever, but you'll never lose the mod. And that's the really, really important thing. Now, obviously, when you're crafting something like this, it can become very expensive, can become cheap. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. But for those that are understanding what I'm trying to say here, it's really impactful. Again, you're taking something like this modifier, this topetane's, you know, percent fire. You're smashing it across with a buckler, right? And again, the cool thing about this is with the initial step with here, because they're 2 different types of bases, it's just RNG. But you can do that process deterministically, because if you had an armor base with the crit mod, you would annul it down until it's just the suffix with the crit mod. You would then get another armor base. You would put some intelligence on it, annul it down so the only suffix is intelligence, and you would just keep recombinating them until it moved on to the base you want. I hope that makes sense. Maybe this video is very confusing, but the key thing to take away is you can take a named modifier and move it onto an item, and if you fail the fracture, as long as if it's the only prefix that is on the item that does not naturally roll, right? Doesn't naturally roll like this 3 energy shield here. Once you get your failed fracture and you put it in the recombinator and you press recombinate, the fracture will disappear, but the prefix will stay. And then you pop out a new base and you're ready to try fracture. And you keep the same process. Now, I hope that makes sense, because it seems really confusing, but have a go with it and you'll be like, oh, I get it now. So yeah, that's how I made that shield. Once I'd then got the fracture, obviously then I spammed my Chaos Essence, and yeah. I hope that helps, because the implication of this is basically, for example, you're moving special modifiers to bases that can't naturally get it, and then you're able to keep it. That's the important thing. And obviously when you can keep it on the base, that's when you can make the cool items.